Good evening. If you will, please take your seats. Thank you. Welcome to the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Lakeside Church of Christ. The viewing for Brother Ron Garner will be held at Lakeside here this Saturday, January 23rd at 10 a.m. The funeral service will follow at 11 a.m. The service will be viewable on live stream. We ask that you please continue to keep the Garner and Ledford families in your prayers at this difficult time. Also on next Wednesday, January 27th at 6 p.m., there will be a senior dinner in the fellowship hall, and social distancing will be strictly observed. Also, due to technological requirements, the display screens in the auditorium will no longer be used. All displays will be on the front and back walls. We ask that to be considerate of others, please avoid using the fellowship hall before, during, and after Sunday morning worship if you aren't wearing a mask. Your thoughtfulness is appreciated. We also ask lastly that you please silence your cell phones or turn them off so they don't disrupt the services this evening. And we'll begin now.
I'm satisfied with just how we low, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the rest will shine, I want a gold one, that silver line. I've got a mansion just over the hilltop, in that bright land where we'll never grow.
Good evening. Hope everyone's having a good week. Tonight I wanted my lesson to be focusing on the golden rule. You know, 2020 was the pits. I can't think of much good about it. And 2021 doesn't seem like it's getting much of a better start. You know, we live in a world that has become progressively polarized, with political unrest, social unrest, and even medical unrest. It seems like no one can agree. What this world needs is for more people that practice what Christ said in Matthew 7, verses 7 through 12. And I'll be reading from the King James Version. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there of you whom, if his son asks bread, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he give him a serpent? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do you even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. But Christ didn't stop there. He took it another step further over in Luke. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 6, 27 through 31. But I say unto you which hear, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do to you, do ye also to them likewise. Just think what kind of world this would be if everyone practiced these passages. Wouldn't it be an awesome place to live? There wouldn't be arguing. There wouldn't be infighting. There wouldn't be despair. In my opinion, it'd probably be the closest thing to heaven on this earth. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, because not everybody's a Christian. But I encourage you not to let what we see going on in the world discourage us. Let it challenge us. Let it challenge us to be the ones who take the golden rule into the world. And specifically into this community of Orange Park that we live in. We may not be able to influence the world as a whole, but we can influence Orange Park. It starts with each individual person. You influence two people, they influence two people, and before you know it, the world will be influenced. You know, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 17 says, when we became Christians, we became a new creation. And Romans 6:4 says, when we were raised from the grave of baptism to walk in newness of life. What we do, what we say, what we write reflects directly on our Master and the church. And for some, we will be the only Christian whose paths they cross. We may be their only hope for salvation. And we have to ask ourselves, the people that we interface with and influence, are they drawn to Christ and His church or pushed away by our actions? And I want to challenge you to live the golden rule. Let's be kind. And let's be a positive reflection of Christ and His church and make a difference for the cause of Christ. Maybe you've been struggling. This past year, there's been so many opportunities to be discouraged and get down. A lot of people's faith has been challenged, while others, their faith has been strengthened. If you've been struggling, now is a good opportunity to come forward and ask for the prayers of your brethren. If you're watching on the live stream, there will be a number that scrolls across the bottom of the screen that you can call, and an elder will answer that call and also bring your concerns, and prayers can be offered up for you as well. Whatever your needs may be, please come forward as together we stand and sing.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for a wonderful day that was so beautiful, and thank you for allowing us to be here together today and just take midweek to learn about you, and let us apply this devotional to our lives tonight, and let us work to be better, to treat one another as we want to be treated. Just thank you for all the blessings you give us each and every day. Just continue to watch over and protect us. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Number 5. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We're ready for our class tonight. The thing that's coming around is your sheet you've probably seen before, but I thought since we were getting into the section about Elijah, I would pass out the character sheet that we had last middle of the year about when we were doing our Bible learning initiative on character studies, just so you would have it in front of you, and you might go over this as you study this passage. If you read some about it at home and you want to think further about Elijah, that might just give you some springboard for your thoughts. And I'm not going to be referencing that sheet. I just wanted you to have it in front of you since we were studying him. And then I thought in connection with that, I would just mention something about our Bible learning initiative for this year, which is, thank you, that we're in the 4th week of it now. And if you are behind, like maybe you were away 1 week or something, and you want to catch up, the information desk is always going to have copies of the previous week's material that is going back to the beginning of the year. They're going to keep a little filing cabinet, not a cabinet really, more like a basket or something like that. What would we call a box? There we go, a little box. And it will have the file, so you can either look it up yourself or you can ask the person at the information desk to look up the previous week for you. And also there are new notebooks out there, if you didn't get one, that are up to date. And so they have the first 3 weeks already stocked in the notebook if you want to grab one of those tonight, or if you would like to give one to someone else. We do have plenty of those, just as we do with the plan of work. We have plenty of extras, so even though we might have been a little cautious about everybody taking one, we do have plenty of extras, so be liberal if you would like to have more of those. A file box. Yes. Trust the tax man to tell us what a file box is. Very good. Thank you. All right. Appreciate that. Okay, number 1. After the sins of which king did God pronounce that he was going to give up Israel? That is, he had already established that they were going to go into captivity, even though it hadn't happened yet. After the sins of which king? I hear Jeroboam. That's correct. So in other words, you didn't even have to wait past the first king. He sinned so egregiously and led the people to sin so egregiously that God had already made his determination. Okay, number 2. Which king of Israel reigned for only 7 days after having murdered his predecessor and then committed suicide? So he reigned for 7 days until he committed suicide. Say again? Zimri. I usually say Zimri, but we're talking about the same person, and you may be correct on that. Zimri. And how did he kill himself? He burned his house down while he was in it. Good. Okay, number 3. Multiple choice. How did Jeroboam die? Now, no peeking. Don't look at the verse. Old age. God struck him. Judah killed him in battle, or a golden calf fell on him. What is it? Does anybody remember? I don't know that we discussed it in depth. We probably just mentioned it in passing, but it's B. God struck him. But remember, God promised through a prophet to Jeroboam's wife that all of the male people in the family were going to be struck down in some form or another. And the only one that would go to a grave in a typical way would be the baby in whom God found some good. Okay, number 4. What king of Egypt despoiled Jerusalem during Rehoboam's reign? We talked about this and we showed some archaeological evidence of his invasion of Judah last week. What was his name? Very famous Egyptian king, and one of those great ones to know about because he's one of just a handful of ancient kings who interact with Israelite or Judean history. So it's good to know about kings like Cyrus and Nebuchadnezzar and Shalmaneser and this one Shishak, the king of Egypt, S-H-I-K-A-K, or S-H-I-S-H-A-K, Shishak. All right, number 5. Which king was Ahab's father? Less famous king, but we'll give him a run for his money on how evil he was. And that would be Omri. And Omri begins one of the dynasties in the northern kingdom, and actually it's typically called the Omride dynasty for that reason. So if you're ever reading along and somebody references in talking about this book, if they reference the Omride dynasty, they're talking about Omri and his sons. Okay, here's our historical outline that we're following in this semester or this quarter. And right now we're still in that first part where the kingdom is divided and we have Israel existing alongside Judah and, of course, frequently fighting with Judah. And here we are tonight ready to talk about Jehoshaphat, one of my favorite kings in our discussion, probably yours too. And then Elijah the prophet, and then Ahab. So we have a southern king to discuss, Jehoshaphat, and a northern king, Ahab, to discuss, and also Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And this section tonight has one of the most well-known chapters in all of our discussion for this quarter, 1 Kings 18, and that's where we have the contest of the gods on Mount Carmel, which was proposed by Elijah, obviously with God's endorsement, because God does exactly what Elijah asks him to do on the mountain, and that was to send fire from heaven and lick up the altar and also consume all the water that had been thrown on the altar and in the trench around the altar. Before we get into that, I wanted to ask this question. Who was Abijah or Abijam's grandmother? You remember we talked about this king who's the son of Jeroboam, and somebody after class last week asked this question, isn't it unusual that Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, and she is said to be the daughter of Absalom in 1 Kings, could be the mother of Abijah. She would have had to have been a very late-born child of Absalom in order for this to work out chronologically. Well, it even goes deeper than that, and I had not looked into this in depth, and so I apologize for not being ready after class last week to deal with this like I should have been. But in Bible, in the literature of critics of the Bible, where they try to find alleged Bible contradictions, this is one of the hot button topics, and I was just not aware of it. But there is an easy solution. Okay, so notice these two passages. In 1 Kings 15, 1 and 2, Abijah's mother is listed as Maacah, the daughter of Absalom. But then when we turn to 2 Chronicles 13, companion account, we find that Abijah's mother was Micaiah. That's just a variant in spelling. That's not what the commentators focus on, just another spelling of the same name. But Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. So the question is, who was Abijah or Abijam's grandfather, really? How do we work out her genealogy in this? Is this a contradiction? So in Jewish usage, remember that the word son can have various meanings, and we're going to see in a minute that the word daughter can have various meanings too. In Jewish usage, son can mean son-in-law, grandson, descendant, son of creation, or son by education. And you can look at all those passages and you will see in the Bible the Jews use the word son more broadly than we do. That's just the fact of the matter. They use the word more broadly than we do. And then the word daughter, similarly, can refer to a daughter-in-law, a female descendant, a woman from a particular area, a daughter of this place, or a woman generally, like the women described in Proverbs 31 and verse 29, that this woman excels among womanhood or women. So, Micaiah or Maacah probably was the granddaughter of Absalom and the daughter of Uriel. That's how those two passages are thought to be reconciled. Granddaughter of Absalom, and this makes more sense in the chronology, that she's his granddaughter and the daughter of Uriel. Josephus says that she was a daughter of Absalom by Tamar, Absalom's daughter who married Uriel, in Josephus's Antiquities. Now, Josephus, of course, is not inspired, but he's in a better position than any of us is to tell what her lineage was. Okay, so that's how we can work out the contradiction. Remember, if somebody says there's a contradiction in the chronology of the Scriptures or in any other area, all we have to do is show a plausible solution. We don't have to prove what the solution is. There may be a variety of alternate solutions. This seems quite plausible to me, given the way son and daughter have those flexible meanings in the text. Okay, any questions or comments about this on how Maacah could be the daughter of this person and also the daughter of this other person? Does that make sense? Okay, good. Just wanted to clear that up because somebody had asked about her after class last week. That's a picture of Baer on the screen, and as we get into the discussion of especially Ahab's reign and how Elijah will confront him, the issue is Baal. The Israelites were trying to be syncretists at this time, and that means they wanted to worship Jehovah while also at the same time worshiping Baal, mixing those two together. So they were trying to make a religion that could sort of ride the fence. And that's what Elijah says they can't do. He says, and this will be our key verse for tonight, 1 Kings 18:21, one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible, maybe yours too. Elijah said, "How long will you halt or hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." In other words, pick a God. If Baal is God, then you should be following him. But if the Lord is God, you should be following him. The only thing that is more ridiculous than following Baal is trying to follow Baal and somebody else, or trying to follow the Lord and somebody else. Pick the one you think is, if you really think Baal is in charge, follow him. But if the Lord is in charge, follow him. And the people, notice, did not answer him a word. That's fascinating. I don't know why they didn't answer him a word. This is the congregation of Israel. Nobody stood up and said, oh, Baal is God. We're just going to throw away Jehovah. But also nobody stood up and said, Jehovah's God, we're going to throw away Baal. You see how confused they must have been. Or how maybe they just weren't educated about the matter of picking a god. Maybe they just grew up sort of thinking that Jehovah and Baal occupied a similar position, and there's just no problem in worshiping a variety of gods. Remember, that's how it was with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Acts 17, wasn't it? When Paul spoke on Mars Hill at the Areopagus, and Paul said, you all are very religious. And some people think that the more gods you add, or the more superstitions you add, the more religious you are, and that's all the better. But really, true religion, in a sense, is quite simple, isn't it? There's one God, and he's revealed himself in the Scriptures and in the person of Christ, and he's the one we follow. So, if the Bible is correct, all other religions other than the biblical religion are false. And you don't even have to study, as helpful as it is sometimes to study other religions. To be right with God, you don't have to study and refute all the other religions. If you found the true one, then you can rule out all the others. It's like if I know that 2 plus 2 is 4, I don't have to go through and refute why 2 plus 2 doesn't equal all the other numbers. See what I mean? Okay, now, let's talk about Jehoshaphat before we get there, though, because we want to cover his reign, and then, in our minds at least, even though the reign of Ahab and Jehoshaphat overlap, the reigns overlap, and they work together, unfortunately. In some cases, they allied themselves together. But we're going to talk about Jehoshaphat first, and then we'll talk about Ahab. Jehoshaphat, overall, did right in the sight of the Lord. And if you put these passages together, what you see is he took pride in the ways of the Lord. I'm sure there are other ways you could translate that in 2 Chronicles, that's 2 Chronicles 17, 3 through 5. But that's one of those passages that says there's a biblical kind of pride. Isn't it in Galatians 6? I can't remember the verse right. 6:14, isn't it? Where the Apostle Paul says, I will glory in nothing. God forbid that I should glory in anything other than what? The cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, Paul's saying I shouldn't have pride in anything. I shouldn't take pride in my accomplishments. I shouldn't take pride in my lineage as a Jew of this tribe or that. I shouldn't take pride in my background as a Pharisee, as one who studied at the feet of Gamaliel. This is Philippians 3 background, remember? Paul says, I count all of those things as being what? Being rubbish. Count all of those things that like garbage compared to the surpassing glory of Christ. So, in what does a Christian take pride? I know that there's a non-sinful sense in which we take pride in our children. It would be wrong not to. And there's a non-sinful sense in which we take pride in our work. Really, when I say, or you say, I go to my job and I take pride in my job, that's a good thing. That's what Colossians 3 teaches, is that we work heartily as to the Lord. We realize that there's a significance to what we're doing. That's all we mean when we say we take pride in our work, isn't it? If we mean it in a biblical, godly way. We're just saying we have an obligation to do a good job, do the best we can. So we see there's a significance in that. We take some pride in it. But properly speaking, there's only one thing we take pride in, and that's God. That's the cross. And here we find that Jehoshaphat took pride in the things of the Lord. And so he had the right kind of pride. And he was blessed with great riches. In fact, this is the high point of wealth for the Jewish kingdom during the reign of Jehoshaphat. And he got a great deal of honor in the process. So the Lord loved what Jehoshaphat did in his reign generally. Now look at some of the things he did. I would just take time to read all these passages, but I'll have to leave that to you because of the brevity of our class. But he fortified Judah against Israel. That just sounds like the Twilight Zone, doesn't it? It's hard to even say that here are these brethren, but that's just how it was, that the Judeans had to fortify their border cities against their brethren, because Israel was going to attack them. We've already seen that, haven't we? Because all through the days of the kings we discussed last week, it seemed they were just fighting one battle after another. And then he twice defeated the Moabites in dramatic fashion, even leading the king of the Moabites. They were beating them so badly that the king of Moab sacrificed his son against a wall. And all the soldiers, at the point when he did that, this is in 2 Kings 3, but at the point when he did that, everybody just went home because they were so, I don't know what the word is, they were just aghast at what he had done. And he defeated them again in 2 Chronicles 20, and this was the amazing case where God confused them, so they just killed each other. The Moabites just started killing each other. And then he removed the idolatrous high places in 2 Chronicles 17:5. Interesting to compare 2 Chronicles 17 with 1 Kings 22, because 1 Kings 22 will explain that although Jehoshaphat did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet he did not remove the high places, but people still sacrificed there. Whereas when you get to 2 Chronicles 17, it says he removed all the idolatrous high places. How do you reconcile that? Well, this is one of the places where you realize there were high places set up for the worship of Jehovah, and there were high places set up for the worship of false gods in in Judah. And he took down the idolatrous ones. So that lets us know that when we read high places in the text, we have to look at the context and see if that's better explained by reference to idolatrous high places or better explained by reference to Jehovah worship high places. And in this case, the only way I can figure out to make sense of it is Jehoshaphat took down the idolatrous ones, because that's clearly what Chronicles says he did. And then he sent officials. This is remarkable. He sent officials through Judah to teach the law to the people. And that is a good pattern for spiritual leaders to follow. You see, I can teach, you can teach, but if we teach somebody else to teach, then how much better will our influence be? How much bigger will it be? Elders can lead today, but one person can only do so much. But what if we train other people to be the elders of the future? Well, then our influence has grown bigger. And Jehoshaphat also recognized that the more educated his people would be in the law of Moses, the more faithfully they would follow him. So there's no way to lose. You can't lose in teaching people the gospel, unless you have a situation that Jesus described in Matthew 5 where you're feeding what's holy to the dogs, and they're going to turn again and rend you. There are times when you need to move on, but generally speaking, you can't lose. It's going to help you, it's going to help them, it's going to help everybody in the future. Always good to teach people the law. Okay, then Jehoshaphat cleansed the land of idolatry, including all of the Sodomites, the male temple prostitutes who remained after Asa's reign. Asa did about as best he could do in getting rid of all these guys, but it took Jehoshaphat, his son, to come along and finish the job. And then he listened to the prophet Jehu, who told him to initiate another effort later to bring the people back to the Lord. And he appointed judges to administer God's justice throughout the land. This guy had a remarkable reign, and that he seemed so focused on doing what was right. I can only imagine that when he allied himself with the kings of Israel, which was a mistake, that he was doing so in the interest of the unity of the people. He shouldn't have done it. In fact, he goes against the prophet Micaiah in agreeing to go to battle at Ramoth Gilead. Micaiah says, this is going to end in disaster. Ahab's going to die. You shouldn't do this. And Jehoshaphat went ahead with Ahab and did it in 1 Kings 22. I don't know why. The Bible doesn't tell us what went through his head that made him do that. But in general, we're talking about a person who was a wonderful king. So here are the bad points. He allied himself with Ahab in a marriage and joined Ahab in this attack against Micaiah's instructions. He entered into a maritime commerce agreement with Ahaziah, the subsequent Israelite king, son of Ahab, for which God punished him by wrecking the ships. And then Jehoshaphat reigned total 25 years and died at age 60 and was succeeded by Jehoram. Okay, that's a really brief rundown of Jehoshaphat's career. But who would like to make a comment or add anything?
I was thinking the issue where people were trying to sit the fence and maybe not speak out may have been something akin to the political correctness that we have today, where we're afraid to say anything for fear of offending somebody, or it could just be that nobody is clear enough on the position to be able to adequately defend it.
Right, okay, the comment is maybe the people's refusal to commit to one God or another was something along the lines of the same attitude that's evinced in political correctness today. I would suggest that's entirely possible because the Israelites would not want to offend the wrong people. And the whole idea of political correctness is not speaking what you know to be true because of who it might offend. And in this case, there was a great, powerful lady you didn't want to offend because she was slaughtering prophets right and left. And in fact, it had come down to where Elijah thought he was the only one left in Israel serving God. She was so wicked. And then we're talking about Jezebel, of course. And so you might well stay silent if you weren't a very courageous person. You might stay silent when you know something's the truth. It might have been all these people are saying, well, we really know Jehovah's God, but if you say that Jehovah's God and Baal is nothing, then you're flying in the face of the king and queen, and they're just going to kill you. So that would give you a lot of motivation. Remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the same exact situation, but they stayed standing when everybody else bowed down, and they did get thrown in the fiery furnace, didn't they? Okay, one more?
This may be sort of tangential. Of course, it's always fascinating in Deuteronomy 17:18, where God says that the king, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on the scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest, shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. I don't know, we're never told that any king ever did that. And this drifting away and idolatry coming in, if the king had written his own personal copy and known the law that well and read it all the days of his life, just think how much different it would have been.
Right. Remind me the reference, forgive me. Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 18 has the command, for those of you who couldn't hear or might be on the live stream. And by the way, I've heard from a couple live stream folks who have told me I need to repeat the questions because they don't hear it, and I apologize sincerely about that. So let me repeat it. The comment was, in Deuteronomy 17:18, God commands that future kings of Israel make a copy of the law and study it for themselves and even teach it to others. But there's no record of anybody doing that. In fact, by the time we get to Josiah later, they don't even know where the copy of the law is. They discover it by accident in the temple. And so that will show that this certainly had not been followed. And every king needs to understand the law he's administering, doesn't he? Whether you're talking about a Jewish king or any other king, got to understand the law you're administering. And for too many Israelite and Jewish kings, they had just forgotten that they were governed by any law other than expediency. And that's true of many churches, isn't it? For all practical purposes, the idea is we're only really governed by expediency. Because even when the Bible seems to speak against what we're doing, if it's expedient, we'll find a way around what the Bible says. And so that's a very sad situation when that occurs. Okay, we got to move on for sake of time. Let's talk about Baal for a minute, because we need to know who our opponent is. We're on Jehovah's side. Let's pretend in our minds that we're Israelites. We're up on Mount Carmel, as we're about to be in our minds with Elijah and Ahab and the 950 prophets. We sometimes say 450 prophets of Baal, but it's 450 for Baal and then 400 more for his female consort, Asherah. So they're all up there, almost 1,000 prophets. We're staring them in the face, and we've got to decide are we going to side with their God or the true one? Baal is a word that means Lord, and he was thought to be the offspring in the Canaanite mythology. He's a Canaanite god, a Canaanite fertility god. So he's supposed to be governing the crops as well as the offspring of the animals and the people. And so you can imagine, as we're going to see, how sexualized the worship of Baal was. But he was associated especially with the crops, which was urgent for the people because of the lack of natural resources in some parts of Palestine. So they turned to idols. Baal was a storm god, and he was frequently in conflict with the god of death. So the idea is Baal's supposed to be the god who brings life, and then Mot was the god who is supposed to bring death. And you don't want Baal to be defeated because that doesn't spell very good fortune for you in the future if you're one of his worshipers. And then you could have Baal-affiliated gods in various places, a localized Baal like Baal-zebub or Beelzebub, as we sometimes call him, and he was lord of the flies. And then you could have Baal-peor, for example, when the Israelites fell into idolatry in Numbers 25 and were punished severely, where 25,000 of them died. They were worshiping Baal of Peor, and he was just called Baal-peor. So you had Baal, but then you had the localized tribal versions of Baal in different places. And it was highly immoral. Children were sacrificed to Baal, according to Jeremiah 19:5, and it involved fornication, which is probably most vividly portrayed in Hosea chapter 2. I thought I'd read you some statements from leading archaeologists about Baal worship and Canaanite worship in general. And as you read this, you might just wonder to yourself, why on earth would the Israelites go after this? But they were heavily influenced by their peers, weren't they? And we could equally say about Christians who have left the Lord. Why would he leave the Lord to go after so-and-so or such and such false doctrine? But that happens, doesn't it? In the temples of the Canaanites, there were male and female prostitutes. We've already been reading about that in the Bible. Sacred men and women, anything but sacred, really, but that's what they were called. And all sorts of sexual excesses were practiced. It was believed that in some way these rites caused the crops and herds to prosper. From numerous biblical and Roman allusions, we know that child sacrifice was occasionally practiced. The story of the Moabite king Mesha, who I referenced, sacrificing his child, he thought maybe he could turn the battle around. Apparently, if he would just, in the heat of the battle, he said, last-ditch effort, kill my son, as if that has anything to do with it. But that's what he thought. Immediately comes to mind. Funerary jars have been found with the bodies of young children distorted by suffocation as they struggle for life after having been buried alive as a sacrifice to Canaanite gods. And so this was indeed a terrible religion. All religions that are not biblical are terrible, but they don't all have this going for them, do they? But then you think about American society today, and our religion of selfishness includes stabbing preborn children in the back of the neck to pull them out and make sure they're dead, or vacuuming them out of their mother's wombs, or injecting a saline salt solution into the sac so that the baby dies. So, are we really that different? We would never, I don't know anybody who worships Baal. Baal is a defunct god, isn't he? But people will come up with ways to worship what they want, and they will do just about anything to worship the god of their own self, even if that's something like elective abortion. Okay? Right. The comment is many of the people, the nations that formerly worshiped Baal eventually went into Islam. That's true. I don't know that you can draw any kind of a causal line between the Baal worship and the later. But, okay, I'm sorry to have to go on, but we just have to go on. Let's draw some differences between Baal and the true God, and then we'll get into our text in 1 Kings 18 about it. Baal was thought to be one god among many. He was part of a pantheon. But that wasn't true of Jehovah. Baal had a female counterpart. God has how many counterparts? Zero. Is there any God beside the Lord? That's how the Ten Commandments begins. You have no other gods before me. Will not tolerate the presence of any other gods. That's the opposite of Baal. Baal was associated with weather. God is not associated with weather. God causes all physical things, including time and space. But God is not more associated with the weather than he is any other feature of nature. God is separate from it. God created the universe. He's not the universe. He has sovereignty over the universe, and he is equally associated with all parts of his physical creation because he's the ultimate cause of all of it. But you don't relegate God to one part of nature and say, well, God's in charge of this part, but he doesn't really have anything to do with this other part. Is God in control of death and life? Is God in control of liquids and solids? Is God in control of whatever, any parts of nature you want to mention? There were images of Baal. That's in direct contradistinction to what God commanded in the Ten Commandments. You shall have no graven images. Make no graven images. Have you observed, even in our auditorium today, as we follow in the lineage of that kind of thought, which is in the New Testament as well? Last verse of the book of 1 John is, little children, keep yourselves from what? From idols. And we don't want to have any physical representations of God that would lead us to be worshiping an image. So we have a very simple auditorium with none of those additions. God has never desired that people try to portray him in a physical object. But that's how Baal, you can still dig up old copies of Baal, old images that represent Baal even today, but not so with the Lord. Even with Jesus, it's amazing that a person as famous as Jesus doesn't have a physical likeness of him from that time period anywhere. Can't find one because he didn't want that to be made. You can go over to Jerusalem and find what is supposed to be the slab on which Jesus' body was laid by Joseph of Arimathea. And people line up to see it, and they will kiss it and try to rub, they rub their hands on it, rub it all over them because they want to have some kind of physical contact with something that was associated with Jesus. God's religion has never worked that way. We relate to God spiritually. We relate to God by doing what he says, not by getting as close to some physical object as we can. Baal never made a covenant with anybody. You prayed to Baal, you sacrificed to Baal, you hoped he would hear you, but he never agreed to do anything, did he? But did God agree? If you will do this, I will do this. You see how different God is from Baal? Baal didn't actually control anything, although they thought he did. But God has the power to control everything and upholds everything by the word of his power. Okay, and then as we're going to see in 1 Kings, God is going to show Baal to be a false god. Okay, I think for the sake of time, we've talked some about chapter 18. Let's begin with chapter 17, and we'll read some of that, and then we'll summarize the events of chapter 18. 1 Kings 17, we're introduced to this magnificent prophet Elijah who just bursts onto the scene and begins to command miracles. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, surely there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Is there any accident that just after Jezebel convinces Ahab to promote Baal worship as the state religion, Elijah comes and says, okay, I'm turning off the water? Because, see, Baal was the fertility god. Baal controlled the rain. And Elijah says, I'm going to speak a word. It's not going to rain or dew for 3 years until I give the word again. And can you imagine Ahab day after day, as the rain still didn't come, just starting to think, maybe I made a little bit of a hasty move in committing myself to Baal worship, because it doesn't seem like Baal actually has any authority at all. And also, when you turn over to James chapter 5, you remember James cites the work of Elijah and says Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and yet he prayed and it did not rain for 3 years. And James uses Elijah as an illustration of the power of prayer, because verse 16 there, right before he talks about Elijah, he says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. So a Christian can look at that passage and say, who are we talking about? Elijah is a human being just like I am, and yet his prayers had this great power. So shouldn't I be praying fervently, knowing that God hears me? And the power was not in Elijah. The power was in God, who heard Elijah pray. And if God heard Elijah, who had a nature like mine, then surely God will hear me pray. Interesting note here, to me, is that the miracles of the Bible are concentrated in 3 places, in 3 periods of history: in the work of Moses, and in the work of Elijah, and in the work of Jesus and his apostles. Okay, so James picks the one person in the Old Testament who arguably had the greatest miracles performed in connection with him and said, he's just like you. Now, when you read that, you think, I cannot do any of the things that Elijah could do. But James is saying the power was not in Elijah. The power was in the God who worked through him. And so pray to God and see if he can't accomplish more than you ask or think, to use the language of Ephesians 3:20. He can do more than you ask or think. So let's remember, as we read about Elijah, we need to pray with the attitude that we're praying to the same God who did all these things for Elijah. So God fed Elijah with the birds while the drought was going on, sent him to a brook. Elijah, by the way, was a foreigner. He was from the east side of the Jordan River. And if you do the study about his background, it seems that he was a Gentile. And so God is sending somebody who descends from pagans to go and instruct the children of Israel on how to worship the true God. That is ironic, isn't it? But that kind of irony persists through the New Testament, because the Jews should have been the ones who were ready for the Messiah, but the Gentiles are the ones who received him. Okay. The brook dried up, so God sent Elijah to the house of the widow at Zarephath, who trusted the prophet enough to feed him with her very last oil and meal, and said they were about to starve. But God saw to that, didn't he? God made her oil and meal jars replenish miraculously until the end of the drought. Elijah raised the widow's son from the dead. And then finally, at the beginning of chapter 18, after many days, God sent Elijah to Ahab to announce that the drought was going to end. And he does it through an intermediary, a righteous man named Obadiah, who was in charge of the house of Ahab. This is not the prophet Obadiah. This is a different Obadiah. But he was hiding 100 prophets in a cave and feeding them. I guess he had access to food in the royal household, so he was probably taking them food from the house to try to keep them alive, even though Jezebel was trying to kill them. And Obadiah did not want to go tell the king that Elijah was looking for him, because Obadiah thought, well, I'll come back and you won't be here. I guess he thought maybe Elijah would chicken out like a lot of other people did when they had to deal with Ahab. So he said, you won't be here. And Elijah says, I sure will be. And so Obadiah is convinced and gets them together, notifies the king. And when Ahab sees Elijah, he says, you troubler of Israel. But he just doesn't get it, does he? Who is the troubler of Israel? It's not Elijah. Elijah is coming to correct the troubler of Israel. And very often that's still the way it is with people who are rebelling against God. When they're challenged on what they want to do, they will try to shift the blame to someone else, when really the sin is with them. And so we all need to be careful that we don't try to shift blame to other people. That's what Elijah did, okay? Elijah challenges the people, as we read a moment ago, to stop trying to serve both God and Baal, and then proposes this contest of the gods in which God dramatically sends fire from heaven after the people of Baal had prayed for hours and even tried to self-mutilate in order to get God, their God, to respond to their prayers. And Elijah pokes fun and says maybe Baal's gone on a trip, maybe Baal is sleeping. And of course, Baal wasn't anything at all. And so God destroyed the altar, and then Elijah told the people, okay, kill the prophets. And at that point, the people were convinced. and they killed all 950 of the prophets, chased them down to a brook at Kidron, and dispensed with them. Elijah then told Ahab that the rain is coming. You need to seek shelter. And so they run to Jezreel, and Elijah beats Ahab to Jezreel. And then in chapter 19, you remember Jezebel is so infuriated about what happened on Mount Carmel when she hears about it. I don't know why she wasn't there. That really puzzles me that she had to learn of this another way. I can't explain that, but she wasn't there. And so when she learned what happened, she sent a message to Elijah promising that he would die within 24 hours. Elijah then runs to Beersheba and gets very depressed as he's hiding from Jezebel. And this may be an occasion where the depression is brought on by a just need of nourishment and a need of rest and a low that comes right after a high. You know, sometimes when we're really working on something and we get a big payoff at the end of something we're working on, we get a big accomplishment or we achieve something, and maybe we stayed up night after night trying to work on it, and then finally we accomplish it. There's a letdown, isn't there, after that? Well, magnify that a few times, and it seems that may have been what Elijah was going through. Some people, when they finish a degree program and they've worked and worked on their dissertation or their thesis, and then they finally defend it, and then they realize that they've achieved their goal, there's depression. There is I've read about this, there's post-graduation depression. And you would think that's the time when they'd be happiest. You finished your what a wonderful thing. Congratulations. But sometimes we start to think, well, what am I going to do now? And so there can be this post-achievement depression. And I don't know exactly what was going on with Elijah, but he just won this great victory. He had led the people to slaughter all these prophets. And he had seen that there was good in the hearts of the people, that they might be turned toward Jehovah, but now he asked God to let him die. He says he wished he would die. And God sent food, an angel with food and water to feed him, and then gives him a job to do, to go to Mount Horeb, and then God appears to him at Mount Horeb and assigns him to anoint Hazael, to anoint Jehu as the next king of Israel. And God also, in appearing to him, to Elijah in a manner of speaking, in a breeze, speaking to him out of a breeze, God says that there are 7,000 in the nation who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So God deals, in my judgment, you might want to comment on this, but it seems to me that God deals very gently with Elijah and appreciates what Elijah had done in standing up for the truth. And even though Elijah gets depressed and acts as though there's nobody left but him, which was just false. It was just false. There were many people who would stand right beside him now. And God is patient, feeds him, gives him water, doesn't strike him. And then God sends, when he's at Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, by the way, another connection between Elijah and Moses. They both met God on Mount Sinai. And then you turn over to Matthew 17, and who's at the Mount of Transfiguration? Moses and Elijah and Jesus. So there's a Sinai connection. But here, God sends an earthquake. He sends a great fire. He sends a strong wind. The rocks have fallen down. Mountains are crumbling around him because God is showing Elijah his great power. But then God comes to Elijah in this little breeze and explains the situation as a father would explain to a child. A father who's much more powerful than the child, but says, here's how things really are. And let me see if I can get through to you. And I appreciate how God dealt with Elijah, because I'm nothing like Elijah. I don't think anybody in here would say I'm on Elijah's level, but we want God to be patient and fatherly with us, don't we? And we know he will be. Okay, then, let's see how much time we have. We have no time. Okay, we will just add this at the end that Elijah passes the mantle to Elisha, or he hasn't passed the mantle, but he gets him to follow him. It's not till we turn over to 2 Kings, as I suppose we'll do next week, that we find the passing of the mantle to Elisha, the next prophet. Okay, well, I appreciate your good attention, and we will cover more next time about Ahab and so forth.